Millionaire in tears, after discovering the black homeless woman who saved him, gave birth to twins. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Lucas Harrington was a very rich man who only cared about money and power. He thought he could have anything he wanted. But one day, the doctor told him something that changed his life forever. The doctor said he could never have children. Lucas felt empty and lost. He didn't know what to do, so he got into his car and drove fast through the snowy night. He didn't care where he was going. He just wanted to escape. But then something terrible happened. He had a horrible accident. A homeless woman saw the crash and ran to help him. Even though it was dangerous, she risked her life to pull him out of the burning car. Later, Lucas would learn something about this woman that would shock him deeply. Winter in Chicago was always very cold. The wind blew hard against tall buildings, carrying icy air through the streets. Inside a giant office building called the Harrington Building, Lucas Harrington stood by the window, looking at the dark sky. This building was home to one of the biggest companies in the country. Lucas was in charge. He was strong, smart, and powerful. At 38 years old, he had become one of the most famous men on Wall Street. He was a man who never lost. In his office, on his desk, was a white envelope from the doctor. He had read the paper inside 100 times. It said, "You cannot have children." No matter how many times he read it, it still hurt. He let out a quiet laugh, but there was no happiness in it. He always thought he was in control of everything, but this was something even he couldn't change. The world saw Lucas as perfect, handsome, rich, and powerful, but no one knew how broken he was inside. He was the only child in the Harrington family, a family known for its wealth and influence. His father, Edward Harrington, had always been a strict man. He never treated Lucas like a son, only as someone who would take over the family business. His mother, Margaret Harrington, was the perfect high society woman. She cared more about status than love. Lucas had grown up in big fancy ballrooms and cold meeting rooms. Family, to him, was not about love. It was about duty. He was supposed to continue the Harrington family name. But now, with the doctor's news, that was impossible. His hands clenched into fists. He had never really wanted children. He didn't want a family. Love, to him, was just like a business deal, useful but not necessary. Still, knowing he had no choice in the matter made him feel powerless. The clock on the wall showed it was 11 p.m. Lucas walked over to the bar in his office and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He stared at the golden liquid but didn't drink it. Then his phone rang. It was his mother. He didn't answer. He knew she was calling to remind him about a big charity event where she expected him to bring a woman with him. His relationships with models and actresses never mattered to her. She wanted him to marry a proper woman, someone from a rich and powerful family, someone who could give him a child. Lucas let out a bitter laugh. What would she say if she knew the truth? He grabbed his coat and left his office. He got into his silver Aston Martin and sped out of the parking garage. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away from the pressure, from the expectations, from everything. Outside, snow fell heavily. The city was cold and empty. Lucas drove fast, the streets blurring past him. He kept thinking about his father's words, "You must have a child to carry on the Harrington name." Those words had haunted him his whole life, and now they felt like a cruel joke. He grabbed the whiskey bottle from the seat next to him and took a long drink. It burned his throat, but it didn't make him feel any better. He had everything: money, power, control. And yet, in the one way that truly mattered, he had nothing. No child, no legacy. By now, he had left the city behind. The road was empty. The trees on both sides of the highway were covered in snow. The wind howled against his car, but he didn't slow down. He pressed harder on the gas. The speedometer climbed 80, then 90. Then his phone rang again. His mother. He ignored the call, but the moment he looked away, something appeared in front of his car, a shadow. His instincts kicked in. He turned the steering wheel sharply. The tires skidded. The car spun wildly on the ice. A loud crash filled the night. The car hit the guardrail and flipped over down the hill. Glass shattered. Sparks flew. Fire started to spread. Graham's head slammed against the window. Blood dripped down his face. His body felt heavy. His breath grew weak. Was this the end? Then, through the darkness, he heard a voice. "Hey, can you hear me? You have to get out." Someone was pulling him, dragging him away from the burning car. A small but strong pair of hands gripped him tightly. Graham's eyes barely opened. He saw a woman, a small, shivering woman with messy hair and old clothes. She was trying to save him. She pulled with all her strength, her feet slipping in the snow. But she didn't stop. She didn't give up. Finally, when they were far enough from the fire, she fell to her knees, gasping for breath. Graham lay on the cold ground. His expensive suit was soaked in snow. He was freezing, but he couldn't move. His body was too weak. "Stay awake. Don't close your eyes," the woman said, patting his cheek. Graham wanted to answer, but he couldn't. His eyes grew heavier. His breathing slowed. Then, warmth. The woman had taken off her own coat and placed it over him. No one had ever done that for him before. Why? That was his last thought before everything went dark. Later, the sound of sirens filled the night. Red and blue lights flashed. The ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed to help. "His pulse is weak," one of them shouted. "We need to move fast." As they lifted Graham onto a stretcher, a paramedic turned to the woman. She was sitting in the snow, shivering, hugging her knees. "Did you call for help?" She nodded. Her wet hair clung to her face. "Do you know him?" She shook her head. "No, I had to help." The paramedic looked at her for a moment. "You need to come with us. You're freezing." She hesitated, but then climbed into the ambulance. As the doors closed, the vehicle sped into the snowy night, its flashing lights disappearing into the storm. That night, Graham Whitaker's life became forever connected to a stranger. A soft white light came through his half-closed eyes, making his head hurt. The pain started at his temples and went down his neck. His whole body ached, but the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the emptiness in his chest, a sadness he had never felt before. Graham Whitaker slowly opened his eyes. He realized he was no longer inside a burning car, no longer surrounded by fire and loud winds. Instead, he smelled something clean, like medicine. He heard a steady beeping sound, a hospital. Graham hated hospitals. He tried to move his arm, but pain shot through his shoulder. He groaned in pain. Right away, a voice spoke beside him. "Mr. Whitaker, you're awake." Graham turned his head and saw a man in a nice suit. It was Jonathan Wells, his assistant, his most trusted assistant. Graham's throat felt dry, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "What happened?" "You were in a car accident," Jonathan said. "If someone hadn't pulled you out in time, we'd be reading your will right now." Graham closed his eyes for a moment. Memories flashed in his mind, the car spinning, the explosion, and then hands pulling him out. A voice calling for help. "Who saved me?" he asked. Jonathan hesitated. "A woman, a homeless woman." Graham's eyes snapped open. "A homeless woman?" "Yes," Jonathan said. "The paramedic said she pulled you out just before the car exploded. She called for help but left before the police arrived. By the time they got there, she was gone." Damien stayed silent. He had met all kinds of people, businessmen, politicians, people who always wanted something. But a homeless woman risking her life for him? That made no sense. Harrison watched him carefully. "Do you want me to find her?" Damien clenched his fingers slightly. "Yes, I want to know who she is and why she did it." Harrison nodded, then added, "Before she left, she put her coat over you to keep you warm." Damien frowned. "A woman who has nothing gave me her only coat?" Harrison pulled out an old piece of paper. "The police found this inside her coat pocket." Damien took it and read the words, even though the paper was torn and old. "The generous will be blessed, for they share their food with the poor." Proverbs 22:9. A strange feeling filled his chest. Damien had never cared about Bible verses or fate, but now, lying in a hospital bed, holding that fragile piece of paper, something inside him changed. He took a deep breath. Find her, as soon as possible. 3 days later, Chicago was covered in snow. The storm had passed, but the sky was still gray and cold, just like Damien's heart. Damien Lancaster didn't usually come to places like this, West Chicago. Here, people without homes sat near old buildings, huddled in blankets, their tired eyes watching expensive cars drive past. To them, the world Damien lived in was far away, a place they could never reach. He didn't believe in kindness for free. In his world, everything had a price. She's here, Damien said, looking out the car window. Harrison, his assistant, nodded. Her name is Eleanor Nora Hayes. She's 31 years old, no criminal record, but no bank account, no ID. She moves around, taking small jobs to survive. Damien frowned. Is she a drug addict? No, Harrison said. People here say she's different. They call her the little angel of West Chicago. She helps others, feeds them, takes care of the sick. And? Damien asked. Harrison hesitated, then said, She always talks about God. Damien raised an eyebrow. A woman with nothing still has faith in God? Harrison smiled. She once said something I think you'd find interesting. What? Faith isn't believing when things are easy. It's believing even when everything falls apart. Damien said nothing. A cold wind blew as Harrison opened the car door. Damien stepped out, careful not to slip on the ice. He walked down the narrow alley, his sharp eyes scanning the street. Then he saw her. A woman knelt beside an old man, gently handing him a cup of warm water. Her long brown hair was messy but soft, wrapped in a scarf. She wore a thin, worn-out sweater, not warm enough for this freezing weather. But what caught Damien's attention was her eyes. Hazel and warm, yet strong. There was no sadness in them, no anger. Only determination, as if she believed she was exactly where she was meant to be. Harrison nodded toward her. That's Eleanor Hayes. Damien took a step closer. His shadow fell over her. Eleanor lifted her head. Hello, Damien said. His voice was calm but firm. She blinked at him, not scared or surprised, just watching him carefully. You were in the accident, she said softly. Damien frowned. He was used to being recognized as a rich businessman, but she remembered him only as the man in the wreck. And you were the one who saved me, he replied. She tilted her head, her face showing no pride. I only did what needed to be done. You could have left me there. Why risk your life? Eleanor smiled. Because we should help each other when we can. Damien stared at her. That answer made no sense to him. He didn't believe in kindness without reason. You weren't afraid? He asked. That car could have exploded. She shook her head. I prayed. Damien scoffed. And God told you to do it? Not exactly, she said. But I believe that if I can save someone, then that's what I should do. Silence filled the space between them. She didn't ask for money. She didn't expect anything from him. She had simply done what she thought was right. Damien exhaled. Do you need anything? Eleanor shook her head. I don't, but many people here do. His jaw tightened. He hated owing people, but this wasn't a debt he could repay with money. Graham looked around, the children shivering near trash cans, the elderly curled under thin blankets, the quiet suffering he had never noticed before. He wasn't sure why he said what he did next, but the words left his lips. I can help. Eleanor watched him for a long moment. Then she smiled. If you really want to help, I'll show you how. Something changed in Graham's eyes. It was something strange. Something he didn't understand. He had never helped anyone before. He had never thought of himself as someone who could do good things. He only cared about making money and staying powerful. But now, as he stood in this small old room with two little children and a kind woman, something inside him felt different, and he didn't know what to do about it. The apartment was small. It was in a quiet part of Chicago. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and warm. Most importantly, it had a door that locked. Lillian Hayes, stood in the middle of the room. Her hands trembled as they rested on a simple wooden table. She had never imagined living in a place like this. No more broken walls, no more cold winds slipping through cracks in the windows, no more nights wondering if she and the children would have to sleep outside. She blinked, trying to understand this new feeling inside her. "What's wrong?" Graham's deep voice came from behind her. She turned to see him standing at the door. His arms were crossed, his sharp eyes looked at her, but tonight they seemed softer. Lillian shook her head. She stopped, searching for the right words. "I'm not used to this." Graham frowned. "Used to what? Having a home? Accepting help?" He let out a slow breath and stepped closer. His hands were in his pockets. His voice was calm, but there was some frustration in it. "Can you stop acting like you have to do everything alone? You helped me. Now I'm helping you. That's all this is." Lillian smiled a little, but said nothing. From the first moment she met Graham, she knew he didn't believe in kindness without a reason. To him, everything was a trade. He was helping her because he thought he owed her, but she didn't want to see it that way. From the bedroom, the children ran out, their eyes big with excitement. "Mama," Ivy squealed, "the room has a real bed." She grabbed Lillian's dress as if she was afraid all of this would disappear. Leo, however, stayed quiet. He stood near the corner, his little body stiff. He watched Graham carefully. Even though he was only 4 years old, he had already learned not to trust easily. Graham looked down at the boy. Their eyes met, neither of them looking away. Finally, Graham spoke. "Have you ever had your own room before?" Leo shook his head. Graham shrugged. "Well, now you do." Lee didn't say anything, but something in his eyes changed. Something small, but important. Lillian watched them. A strange feeling stirred inside her. "Why are you doing this, Graham?" she asked softly. Graham looked at her, something unreadable in his face. "You saved my life. I don't like owing people." Lillian smiled gently. "You don't owe me anything." Graham clenched his jaw. Maybe she was right. But one thing was certain. Ever since she had pulled him out of that burning car, something inside him had changed. And now he couldn't walk away from this woman and these children. Sat at his desk, tossing a newspaper onto the table. He leaned back, rubbing his forehead. Billionaire Graham Whitaker linked to a mysterious homeless woman. Whitaker heir buys a home for a woman with no past, no family, no reason. Who is the woman who changed Wall Street's coldest heart? On the front page, there was a photo of him standing beside Lillian at the apartment door. She had tried to avoid the cameras, but the reporters always found everything. Graham was used to being in the news. People talked about his business deals and his love life all the time. But this time, it felt different. Because for the first time, he wasn't in control of the story. His assistant, Daniel Carter, stood nearby. This spread faster than I expected. Graham picked up his glass of whiskey, swirling the golden liquid but not drinking it. Jonathan's face stayed neutral. "I think you don't usually care what the media says." Graham smirked. "True, but my mother does." Exactly 1 hour later, his mother, Vivian Whitaker, arrived. She didn't knock. She never did. Her heels clicked against the floor as she entered, bringing in a cold, powerful presence. "Graham," she said sharply. "What is this?" Graham didn't even look up. He poured himself another drink. "You'll have to be more specific." "The woman," she said, her voice controlled but firm. "The press is all over this. People are calling me, asking what my son is doing." Graham took a slow sip of his drink. "I didn't know my personal life needed an explanation." "Graham," she snapped, "you cannot be involved with a woman like that. A homeless woman with no background? Do you know how bad this looks for our family?" Graham leaned back, his expression dark. "The company is fine, I am fine, and I'm not involved with anyone." Vivian took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Graham, you are the heir to the Whitaker empire. You don't get to act like an ordinary man. Every choice you make has consequences. Graham knew exactly how his mother thought. She believed relationships were business deals. Marriages were plans. Everything had to have a purpose. But he wasn't that boy she used to control. His voice was steady. I've met many people. None of them were like her. She saved my life and didn't ask for anything. Vivian gave a soft, cold laugh. Is that what you think? Tell me, Graham, what does she want? He looked her in the eye. Nothing. Vivian hesitated, just for a second. Then she shook her head, almost as if she pitied him. Graham, you are still so naive. Everyone has a price. If she doesn't want money, she wants something else. And a woman who desires more than wealth is dangerous. Graham's grip tightened on his glass. Vivian studied him. Don't tell me you actually care about her. Graham didn't answer, but in his silence, Vivian understood everything. She exhaled, then smiled slightly. Very well. Then let me take care of this for you. Later that evening, Lillian sat in silence, staring at the thick envelope on the table. Inside was a check with enough money to change her life forever. But it wasn't the amount that shook her. It was Vivian Whitaker's words. You will ruin him. Vivian hadn't threatened her. She had simply told her the truth. Graham was from a world she could never belong to. With trembling hands, Lillian wrote a letter. She placed it on the table. Then, with tears in her eyes, she walked out into the night. Graham returned past midnight. The apartment was too quiet. He looked around. No children, no Lillian. Then he saw the letter. He picked it up and read it slowly. She was gone. Graham clenched the letter in his fist, his jaw tightened, his heart pounded. She thought his world was not meant for her. She was wrong, and he wasn't going to let her go that easily. Chicago was in the middle of a big winter storm. The strong winds hit the tall buildings and snow covered the empty streets. For most people, it was just another cold and snowy day. But for Graham Whitaker, this past week had been the longest of his life. It had been 7 days since Lillian left. Graham sat in his office, looking out at the gray sky. His desk was clean and neat, just like always. But right next to a big pile of papers was something that didn't belong in his world. A letter. He had read it so many times he lost count. You gave us hope, but your world is not meant for us. Thank you for everything. Take care. The neat but strong handwriting felt like a sharp knife in his heart. Graham was not a man who let his feelings control him. He never let anyone walk away from him so easily. But Lillian, she didn't just leave. She disappeared, vanished, and Graham couldn't accept that. He looked everywhere for her, every bus station, every homeless shelter, every poor neighborhood where she might have gone. But it was like she had never existed at all. His fingers curled tightly around the letter. His sharp eyes were now filled with an exhaustion he refused to admit. He didn't understand why he felt this way. Lillian was just a woman who once saved his life. He only wanted to help her. Now that she was gone, he should feel nothing. The debt was paid. The matter was over. But then why did she haunt him? Why did he see her warm eyes every time he closed his own? And why did thinking about Theo and Ivy, the 2 small children, make him feel so guilty? Graham took a deep breath and pushed all these thoughts away. Work. That was something he could control. Just as he reached for a file, his phone buzzed loudly on his desk. He looked at the screen. An unknown number. He hesitated, then picked it up. Mr. Callahan? A woman's voice. She sounded worried. His eyebrows came together. Who is this? I'm calling from St. John's Hospital. Your number was listed as an emergency contact for a patient, Elena Carter. Graham's heart stopped for just a second. What happened? His voice turned cold and sharp. She was in a car accident. Her condition is critical. She's in emergency surgery right now. Graham jumped to his feet. His chair fell to the floor, but he didn't care. I'm on my way, he said before hanging up. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of his office. The storm outside was strong. Snow covered the streets and the wind howled. But Graham didn't care. If he didn't get to her in time, he might lose her forever. His car sped through the slippery roads. His hands held the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had driven many times before, but never with this kind of fear in his heart. Elena was in an accident. He couldn't stop hearing those words in his head. He couldn't bear to imagine her lying in the street, hurt as paramedics tried to save her. She had left him once, but if she left him forever this time, Frime. He refused to finish that thought. 20 minutes later, Graham slammed the brakes in front of the hospital. He didn't even wait for the car to stop properly before jumping out. Snow stuck to his coat. His breath came out in quick white puffs as he hurried inside. The hospital halls were quiet, but they felt heavy with tension. Nurses moved quickly, tired from long shifts. But Graham only focused on one thing: the two small figures sitting outside the emergency room, Ethan and Lily. The children were curled up on the hard chairs. Their thin coats were not warm enough. Ethan's arms were wrapped around his sister as if he was trying to protect her from the big, scary world. Lily pressed her face against him, her big eyes full of fear and exhaustion. Graham stopped. The sight of them alone, trembling, felt like a knife to his heart. He took a step forward, but Ethan lifted his head. His eyes recognized Graham, but instead of looking happy, he looked afraid, as if Graham might disappear just like Elena had. Graham knelt down in front of them. His voice was softer than usual. "How long have you been here?" Ethan bit his lip and held Lily's hand tightly. "I don't know," he whispered. "They took him." He stopped himself. "They took her a long time ago." Graham swallowed the lump in his throat. He slowly held out his hand. "Come here." Lily was the first to move. She blinked at him, unsure, but then she stepped away from Ethan and walked toward Graham. When he opened his arms, she hugged him tightly, her small body shaking against him. Graham held her close. She was so small, so fragile. Ethan didn't move at first. His eyes were unsure. Graham didn't say anything. He just reached out and rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. For a long moment, Ethan stayed still. Then, slowly, he leaned in. And just like that, for the first time in his life, Graham Callahan held two children, not because he had to, not because it was part of a plan, but because he couldn't let them feel alone in their pain. The emergency room doors stayed closed. Seconds turned into minutes. Minutes turned into hours. Graham had never prayed before, but now, sitting with two children in his arms, he whispered into the silence of his own mind. If there is a God, if there is anything out there, don't take her away. Let her live. At 5 a.m., the door to the recovery room finally opened. Graham's head lifted immediately. A doctor walked out, his face tired. Graham stood up at once. "How is she?" he asked, his voice steady but desperate. The doctor pulled down his mask and sighed. "The surgery was successful, but she hasn't woken up yet. Now it's up to her." Graham's fists clenched. She was alive, but no one knew if she would wake up. He looked down at Henry and Rose still asleep against him. They didn't understand what those words meant, but he did. And if Eleanor didn't wake up, their world and his would fall apart. The morning light streamed through the hospital window. The steady beeping of a heart monitor filled the quiet room. Eleanor Hayes slowly opened her eyes. The first thing she felt was pain. Her body ached. She blinked, trying to see clearly. She was alive. Her fingers twitched, and that's when she felt it, warmth, a hand holding hers. She stiffened and looked up. James Calloway was there, sitting beside her. His big hand was wrapped around hers, even in his sleep. His usual perfect shirt was wrinkled, his eyes dark with exhaustion, and when he opened his eyes and saw her awake, something in them changed, something raw and unguarded. "You're awake," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Eleanor's lips were dry, her throat ached, but she forced out the words in her mind. "How long have you been here?" James tightened his grip on her hand. "Long enough to know I never want you to leave me again." And beside him, sleeping in their chairs, were Henry and Rose. Eleanor took a deep breath when she saw them. Henry was curled up close to James, his small head resting against him. Rose was next to them, her tiny fingers holding onto James' coat like it was her safety rope. James had stayed with them all night, protecting them. He hadn't left their side. A lump formed in Eleanor's throat. She whispered, "How long have they been here?" Msh looked down at the sleeping children. His face softened in a way Eleanor had never seen before. "Since you went into surgery, they wouldn't leave," he said. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "And neither would I." Eleanor swallowed hard. James Calloway had once said he didn't need family. He didn't want to be attached to anyone. He thought family was a burden. But now, here he was, holding two children like they were a part of him, like they belonged to him. Was this a dream? Because if it was, she never wanted to wake up. James looked at her for a long time before he spoke again. His voice was steady but soft. "You're not leaving me again, Eleanor." She froze. James was a man who didn't waste words. But this was different. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she could trust him. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized one thing. This was not the same man she had met weeks ago. James Calloway had changed. But was the change real? Eleanor had prepared herself for many things. She had been ready to wake up and find him gone. She had expected that he would pay her hospital bills and move on, thinking that was enough. She had prepared to be alone, just like she always had been. But she hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't prepared for James Calloway to still be here, sitting beside her, holding her hand tightly, like he was afraid that if he let go, she would disappear again. And she definitely hadn't prepared for him to say those words. "You're not leaving me again, Eleanor." Her lips parted, but no words came out. James held her gaze for a long time before he let out a slow breath, like he was trying to figure out something he had never said before. "I'm not good at talking about my feelings." His voice was low and rough, like he hadn't slept in days. "But since you left, I realized I can't go back to the way things were." Eleanor clutched the blanket in her hands, looking away. "James, you don't have to feel responsible for me," she whispered. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me and the children." "This isn't about responsibility," he cut in. His voice was strong, sure. "I'm not here because I owe you. I'm here because I want to be." She froze. James looked surprised by his own words, but he didn't take them back. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with something that made it impossible for her to run away. "When you left, I told myself it was for the best, that you'd be better off without me," he said quietly. "But every day without you, I realize something. My life means nothing without you in it." Eleanor's heart squeezed. She wasn't used to hearing words like this from him. Julian Archer was a man who liked control, who followed logic, who stayed calm. But this time, he wasn't trying to control anything. This time, he was letting himself feel. She shook her head. "Julian, your world and mine are too different. You don't understand." He didn't look away. "I understand more than you think." His voice was quiet, sincere. "I spent my whole life believing family was a burden, that love was just a weakness. But you proved me wrong." Eleanor bit her lip. The walls around her heart were starting to crack. Julian let out a soft, almost helpless laugh. "I don't know how to make you believe me, but I can tell you one thing for sure." He leaned in, his voice steady. "I need you. And not just you. I need Caleb and Amelia too." Her breath caught. Julian had never spoken about them like this before. It was one thing for him to care about her. But the children? They weren't his. They didn't share his last name. They didn't share his blood. And yet here he was saying he needed them. Not for her. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Her eyes burned with tears. But just as she was about to answer, fear crept into her heart. Could she trust this? Could Julian truly understand what it meant to have a family? "You say that now," she whispered, "but what if one day you don't feel the same? Julian stilled. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to say the truth she had been too scared to admit. You're a powerful man, Julian. You've never been tied down to anyone before. But if you choose them, if you choose me, this isn't something you can change your mind about later. If one day you wake up and realize you don't want us anymore, then what? Silence. Then Julian took a deep breath. I know you're scared, he said softly, and I don't blame you. You've been left behind too many times. He paused before adding, but if this was just about helping you, I would have walked away when you left. He looked at her, but I didn't. I found you. I stayed, and I'm not going anywhere. A single tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek. She wanted to believe him, but could she risk her heart again? Julian watched her carefully, then slowly reached out and wiped her tear away. Let me prove it to you, he whispered. Let me do the right thing. Eleanor looked at him for a long time, and for the first time she didn't push him away. The hospital room was silent. Eleanor's heart pounded. She had spent her whole life standing on the edges of people's lives. She had learned one painful lesson: never expect anyone to stay. And yet Julian, he was here. Are you sure? She asked, her voice shaking. Are you absolutely sure this isn't just a moment? Julian didn't hesitate. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. A tear slipped down her cheek. You don't understand, she whispered. Choosing me isn't just choosing a woman. It's choosing every hardship, every struggle. It's choosing a burden. Julian smiled gently. Eleanor, do you think I haven't faced challenges before? His eyes were steady. I've lost things I thought I could never live without, but this time I refuse to make a mistake. He took her hand. I want to adopt Caleb and Amelia. Eleanor's eyes widened. You, what? I want to be their father. Legally, permanently, Julian said. I want to protect them, take care of them, love them as my own. Her breath caught. She had never dared to hope for this. Julian brushed away her tears. I'm not leaving, and I will never leave them alone again. A sob escaped her lips. She had been afraid for so long, but looking into his eyes, she knew. He wasn't leaving. She took a shaky breath and nodded, and for the first time, she didn't feel alone. Morning came to the Chicago suburbs, covering the big house in golden sunlight. The bright light shone through the beautiful garden, making soft shadows under the tall trees. The fresh morning air smelled like flowers, and birds were singing happily. Standing by the big window, Eleanor looked outside, feeling thankful. A year ago, she never thought she would have a life like this, a home, a place where she and the children didn't have to worry about where to sleep, a life where she didn't have to be scared that Caleb and Emily would be hungry or cold. A year ago, she had tried to leave the man who had changed everything. She believed that she and the children didn't belong in his world. But now, here she was in his home, a home that was full of warmth, love, and family. In the garden, Caleb and Emily were playing, laughing in the fresh morning air. They had changed so much. They were no longer scared. They had found where they belonged, all because of James. Evelyn looked toward the garden and saw him standing there, holding a cup of coffee. He was watching over them with quiet care. James Carter, a man who once seemed cold and distant, a man full of power and riches. But now he stood there, listening to Emily as she talked excitedly about a little butterfly she had found. A year had passed, and he was no longer the same, not because he had to change, but because he wanted to. Nobody would believe that James Carter, the serious businessman, now spent his nights reading bedtime stories to Caleb and Emily. Nobody would have thought that the man who once laughed at love now knelt in the mornings to tie Emily's shoelaces before school. But he had done all these things easily, as if he was always meant to be part of their family. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling her heart fill with warmth. Today was a special day. It was Caleb and Emily's birthday. They had been counting down for weeks, excited about their little party in the garden. They didn't care about big gifts or fancy celebrations. They only cared about spending the day with Evelyn and James as a family. Evelyn never thought she would have something this perfect. "Why aren't you downstairs with them?" a deep, familiar voice asked. A shiver ran through her. She turned and saw James standing in the doorway. He wore a light blue shirt with his sleeves rolled up. He looked confident, like the man who ruled boardrooms and made big business decisions. But to her, he was no longer just James Carter, the billionaire. He was the man who had stayed. She smiled softly. "I'm just taking a moment." Her voice was quiet, full of emotion. "I can't believe it's been a year." James stepped beside her, looking at the children in the garden. "Neither can I," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "But I have no regrets." Evelyn turned to him, her heart beating faster at the honesty in his eyes. James reached out and touched her cheek gently, his fingers warm. "Today is a special day," he said with a small smile, "and I have a surprise for you." Evelyn frowned a little. "A surprise?" James didn't answer. He took her hand and led her downstairs into the sunny garden. Under the trees, a simple but beautiful party was ready. Tiny fairy lights hung from the branches, glowing warmly. A long wooden table had birthday cakes, colorful balloons, and neatly wrapped gifts. Caleb and Emily ran to them, their eyes bright with happiness. "Mommy, Daddy James has a surprise for us!" Emily shouted, jumping up and down. Evelyn froze. "Daddy James?" She turned quickly to James, her eyes wide with surprise and hope. James just smiled. Then he knelt in front of the two children and pulled out two small velvet boxes. Caleb and Emily went quiet, watching him closely. "Caleb, Emily," James said, opening the boxes. Inside were two silver necklaces with their names on them. "Today is not just your birthday." His voice was steady, full of love. "Today is special for another reason." He paused, his eyes soft. "Because from this day forward, I will always be your father." Caleb's eyes widened. "Really?" His voice was small, like he was scared to believe it. James nodded. "I finalized the adoption. You are now officially Caleb Carter and Emily Carter." Evelyn covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. She couldn't stop crying. Caleb stood still for a moment, then suddenly ran into James's arms. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you." Ivy, tears running down her small face, hugged them both tightly. Graham held them close, strong and steady, as if he would never let go. Over their heads, his eyes met Lillian's. No words were needed. She understood. This wasn't just a legal decision. This was a promise that he would never leave, a promise that they were truly a family now. Laughter filled the garden. The sunlight shone through the trees, making everything warm and golden. It was the perfect picture of a family that once felt impossible. Lillian stood still, her heart full of love. She had never imagined a moment like this. Graham slowly stood up, his gaze never leaving hers. He reached out, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. His touch was so soft, yet his eyes held something deep, something unshakable. "Do you know today isn't just special for Theo and Ivy?" Graham's voice was quiet, but full of meaning. Lillian blinked. "Graham, what are you talking about?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to Jonathan Wells, his trusted assistant. Jonathan stepped forward, handing Graham a small, deep blue velvet box. Lillian's breath caught. She felt her whole body freeze. Graham turned back to her, his face steady and sure. Then, to her complete shock, he knelt down. Time seemed to stop. Theo and Ivy gasped, their eyes big with excitement. The staff around them went silent, watching. Lillian's hands flew to her mouth. Her heart pounded loudly. Graham slowly opened the box. Inside was a ring, not too fancy but beautiful, a shining diamond on a simple white gold band. "Lillian Hart," he said, his voice strong. "I spent years chasing money and power, thinking they were the only things that mattered. But you taught me something." He paused, his eyes locked on hers. His next words were a vow, a promise. "Happiness isn't something you find alone. It's something you build with the people you love." Lillian took a shaky breath. Graham held her hand tightly, keeping her steady. "This isn't just a promise, Lillian," he said. "This is my choice. I choose you. I choose them. I choose the family we've built together. Tears ran down her face. Graham, she couldn't speak. For so long she had been afraid of love, afraid it would slip away. But here was Graham, a man who once didn't believe in family, now kneeling in front of her, offering his heart. Marry me, Lillian, Graham said. His voice didn't shake. He had no doubts. This was love. This was his choice. Theo and Ivy jumped up and down. Say yes, Mommy, say yes. Lillian looked into Graham's deep, steady eyes, and this time she wasn't afraid. A tearful smile broke across her face. Yes, Graham, I'll marry you. The garden burst into cheers. Theo and Ivy screamed with happiness. Graham smiled, sliding the ring onto her shaking finger. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if he would never let go. The storm was over, and at last, they were a real family. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.